We're in the final days of a brutal presidency. Hundreds of thousands of people have died, and hundreds of thousands are expected to die in the near future from COVID. And this president wants to execute every last prisoner on death row. I thought we'd learned a lesson about the death penalty, that it doesn't work, that it doesn't stop people from killing. So we have a video we made 30 years ago on the Earth Network called The Death Penalty, where we explore what happened to one guy who was innocent, who was convicted and about to be killed. But some very active, great people saved his life. Here's their story.
In the United States of America, nearly 7,500 men and women have been executed since the year 1900. Currently, more than 2,000 people are on death rows throughout the 38 states which uphold the death penalty as a possible solution to the problem of violent crime. Of all Western industrial nations, only the United States deliberately kills some of its citizens who have been convicted of murder. It does this in the name of the people. It does this in your name.
Basically, he is basically guilty. They should crucify him by executing him. As simple as that.
Eye for an eye?
It should be only one half of those appeals. One appeal be done in 14 days, execute him in 21 days after this.
What about people who might be innocent?
How many innocent people do get executed? Innocent people walk down the street and get killed. You stop the people who walk down the street and get killed? Automobile accident? Spend $25,000, $30,000 a year to keep him in jail? What for? If he's guilty, he's guilty.
Innocent people are oftentimes put to death, and most crimes are crimes of passion and things, and oftentimes can be racial.
I'm against the death penalty, but I believe that there should be public executions so that people can understand what's going on, and I just believe that at this point that's the only way. If there are public hangings, then people are going to understand what is happening with this.
It sounds absurd, but I feel really strong about it. I think that they could be used as guinea pigs, like for AIDS or cancer, something that would benefit mankind. That's my personal opinion. Okay?
My name is Darby Tillis. I was wrongfully, unlawfully, unjustly convicted for a crime that I did not commit. It's been 9 years, 1 month, and 17 days in the penal system. 4 years was spent on death row. I was tried 5 times. I had 3 hung juries.
And the crime was?
Double murder, armed robbery. One day I would be free, and I wasn't going to let the system destroy me. I wasn't going to let the system make me a victim to hate. I wasn't going to let the system rob me of all the goodness within me. And I had to fight that. I had to fight every day within myself to be able to be a human being and to live and to love despite what had happened.
Why we, of all people, get involved in defending the lives of common criminals in the United States. This doesn't make sense in a lot of people's minds. For us, it's a natural outcome of the work that we do. There's an article in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that says that no one should be subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And that justifies and gives base to our work against torture and against executions. If we take a look at the word degrading and what it means to take away by degrees something, in this case the humanity of a prisoner. And the last degree of humanity that any of us would have in or out of prison is our breath. So we consider that we're mandated by that article in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which the United States government is signatory, to make sure that the state does not execute its prisoners. We consider this to be a moral position, and we consider it to be a human rights position, that it actually has to do with the defense of the rights that are inalienable and belong to people by birthright.
I'm Kevin McDonald. I'm a volunteer coordinator for anti-death penalty work for Amnesty International in Illinois. I'm also the vice chair of the Illinois Coalition Against the Death Penalty. I oppose the death penalty because I believe it's brutal and barbaric and really unnecessary. It doesn't do what it's advertised to do, that is, to protect us from criminal violence. Our country has a very serious problem with violent crime.
I'm against the death penalty because I think it's racist and it singles out black men to be executed unjustly. And I think that the single most devastating idea is that people may be innocent and they're still being executed.
I had a good attorney, Mitchell Ware. I had to get rid of several attorneys, not public defenders, but private attorneys. And my appellate attorney was Mark Fogelberg. And I had always said in my heart that everybody's doing unfair practices, but somebody's not going to risk their profession to go along with this mess. So when Mark came to see me at Stateville, he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You're innocent." And from that day on, things began to change. Things began to work in my behalf. And after my case I won my appeal. All 7 judges ruled in our favor. My case was reversed and remanded back to Cook County, back to the lower courts. And Rob Warden, editor of The Lawyer, ran an article about our case. And every man that sits in the penal system innocent feels that somewhere someone knows. One day that someone is coming forward. Some way the truth is going to come out. First of all, it's immoral, it's racial, it's prejudice, discriminates. Secondly, you cannot bring a man back from the grave if he's been executed, if later on you find errors.
I'm an assistant appellate defender with the Office of the State Appellate Defender, which is a state agency that represents indigent defendants on appeal. I'm in the Supreme Court unit, which specializes in representing people on appeal who have been sentenced to death throughout the state of Illinois. Now, beyond the questions of morality, about whether it's moral to take another human life no matter what, if you get past the morality to the practicality, it is impossible to devise and implement a system free of racism, free of bias, free of arbitrariness, that actually can pick out those handful of people that society in a principled way can deem have forfeited their right to live. It can't be done, and politicians and judges and prosecutors are just fooling themselves to think that that's what the system does now. The experience that we've had in this country with the death penalty since it was reestablished in 1976 is that by the time people who have been sentenced to death get to federal court, challenging their death penalties in federal habeas corpus cases, the rate at which they win their cases in federal court, the rate at which the federal courts say that their death penalty is unconstitutional, has been as high as 70%, and it's now averaging about 50%. And a lot of those reversals are based on the fact that their lawyers were incompetent. The other side of the coin is, as I mentioned before about the prosecutors, in Illinois we have 102 counties. Each county has a head prosecutor. They each can set their own standards on when they ask for death penalty cases. No one in Illinois gets the death penalty unless the prosecutor first asks for it. And in Illinois, you can find one county where the prosecutors always ask for the death penalty after a person's been convicted of murder. And in the next county, you can find a prosecutor who never asks for the death penalty when someone's been convicted of murder. And you can find a third county right adjacent to those two where the prosecutor looks at each case on a case-by-case basis. So it's just so random. It really is like being struck by lightning, which is the exact ground that the U.S. Supreme Court struck it down on in 1972. The vast majority of people on death row are guilty of murder. There is probably a very small minority on death row who are not guilty of the murder. There's a couple problems with that, though. One is it's impossible to distinguish the people who aren't guilty from the people who really are guilty. So that small minority is still subject to losing their life, just as the people who are guilty. The second thing is, although a person may be guilty of murder, the law requires more for them to be sentenced to death. It has to be a particularly aggravated type murder. The person has to have a particular kind of background in their life. They have to supposedly be the worst of the worst. You know, people in favor of the death penalty say that's who it's for. You know, the worst killers of them all. But in practice, you find out that the death row is not reserved for the worst of the worst. There's a Professor Radelet who did a very comprehensive study and came to the conclusion that at least 23 people have been executed in this country in this century who were actually innocent. But as I said before, you don't necessarily need to be actually innocent. In Florida, there was a legal issue that had to do with what kind of evidence the jury could consider in deciding whether or not a person gets the death penalty. The courts kept rejecting this issue over and over, saying, you don't have the right to put in this specific type of evidence. You don't have the right. 18 people were executed in Florida. And then the U.S. Supreme Court, out of nowhere, decided to take this issue, and they decided, yes, the defendants do have the right to put in this type of evidence. And so people don't get executed anymore in Florida as a result of not having that type of evidence in. But 18 people are dead before this change in the law. If they had been sentenced to life, they could all get the benefit of this change in the law, and the fact that they were unconstitutionally sentenced to death could be reversed. But as you say, once you're executed, it's irreversible. You can't give that person their life back. It just shows how much of a blind lottery the death penalty really is, that there's no way to really distinguish between who gets it and who doesn't, except for one very invidious factor, and that's race. If you kill a white person in this country, studies have shown you are anywhere from 4 to 12 times more likely to be sentenced to death. And if you're a person of color who kills a white person, the odds are even higher that you're going to get the death penalty. And theories are that that has to do just with the higher value that our society places on the life of a white person as opposed to a person of color, and also the fact that prosecutors make a real effort to keep people of color off of juries. So you find that juries who sentence people to death are overwhelmingly white.
As quoted by Seymour Simon, former Illinois Supreme Court Justice, it is appalling to realize that whether or not the state inflicts death on its citizens is as much a matter of chance as it is of choice.
Deregulation, as it has affected capital punishment, has meant that the Supreme Court and the federal government have taken a hands-off position and said, okay, it's up to the states, and the states can make decisions on this, and therefore it puts the lives of the citizens directly under the responsibility of state legislatures.
Ultimately down to an individual, in the case of the right of a governor to stay in execution.
That's right, and very often to one individual. And for a decision like this to rest in the hands of one individual is certainly an awesome one, a fear-inspiring one, I would think. It's not the right of the state to carry out an act that is seen as criminal when carried out by a citizen. And that's the bottom line there.
We have to address the problem of violent crime. It's a problem that affects an enormous number of Americans. An enormous proportion of Americans have suffered, or family members of theirs. Family member of mine has. It's very common. It's a very difficult problem, and it needs to be addressed with a great deal of thought and care and attention, with something that will work, rather than to offer something like the death penalty, which doesn't work, and for the politicians to act as if they've done something about the problem in doing that. They haven't. They need to address the problem of crime.
We have to get people to look at our whole justice and correction system, and then the whole issues of why there is a rise in crime in cities, and address those issues, and not try to take care of it after the fact with a few symbolic numbers of the poor, of the dispossessed of our country that end up on death row. By killing a person after the fact, we're not really solving the fact that more of these crimes are happening on our streets. And as a woman, as a mother, I'm as concerned as anybody. I want to be able to walk safely on the streets of Chicago. I want to be able to have my children walk safely on the streets of Chicago. And the issues of safety are, to me, very, very important. But nobody is solving them by killing the people that are already in prison and should probably stay in prison. In the United States, we find that there appears to be wide support for the use of capital punishment. In a couple states that Amnesty International has polled, we find that there is support in some states as high as 84%, as in Florida, as low as 69% in Kentucky and Nebraska. However, when you start asking people specific questions, or when we start offering alternatives, this support for capital punishment dramatically drops. For example, if we say to people, would you believe in capital punishment if there was a system, a correction system, that kept a person in prison either for life or adequately taken care of, and you would be guaranteed that this person would not be out on the street and committing the same act in a couple of years? They prefer an alternative.
People need to be more knowledgeable of the judicial system. They need to have more knowledge of what goes on in the court system, especially in Illinois. Most people take for granted the court of Illinois. You have policemen, state's attorneys, manufacturing cases, lies that they call honest presentation of facts. You have public defenders with overloaded, have too many caseloads, too heavy a caseloads, I should say. You've got deals being made between state's attorneys, between policemen, between lawyers, between public defenders, and you got judges that sanction that for many reasons. You have overzealous prosecutors who want to get a name for themselves. They want to write a book. They want to get on TV. They want to propagate their profession, and they're using human bodies.
So it's a combination of a system that is prone to error and, in some instances, a prosecutorial overreaching and misconduct that can result in innocent people being convicted. This society for 400 years has been a pretty violent society. If you look on your televisions and your movies and the cinema, violence sells. And so we're probably talking about some fundamental changes in the values of the whole society before we can really begin to make some significant inroads into death penalty opposition. But I think it's going to happen. Hopefully too many innocent people won't be executed before it does happen. But it's very remarkable that in 1990 in the United States of America we have the situation when every other Western industrial democracy has abolished the death penalty. The number one cause of death for African American males between the ages of 15 and 35 is murder. And typically it's one black male killing another. And that's of concern to me as well. And so what I think our society needs to do is to begin to look at the sources of crime and begin to focus more resources on crime prevention as opposed to law enforcement and crime control. And I think once we begin to make that shift of resources to dealing with some issues of poverty, miseducation, racism, etc. Once we begin to make that shift, then I think the fallacies that are surrounding the death penalty will become more in focus. Plus, the death penalty process, it just takes so long. And it's so expensive. And the scrutiny is so close that oftentimes you have retrials or resentencings, forcing the victims' families to go through the process over and over again. So I don't think that it's a unanimous view that all victims' families want the accused person to be sentenced to death. That's a fallacy. There have been many instances where the victim's family has been opposed to execution because it makes them just as inhumane as the murderer. It makes them murderers too. And some people are able to see through that grief and not want that kind of guilt on their shoulders. I think the people that are pro-death penalty, by and large, are people that have not spent the time to really study and analyze the problem. They're revenge-oriented. And while revenge certainly has a place in, or may have a place in one's personal dynamics, I don't think our society should construct laws and a system of justice that operates on the basis of revenge, that operates on the basis of bloodlust or thirst for other human lives. So I, in talking to my children, I think that they, at this point, have an understanding that while people may commit very heinous crimes, may do bad things, that they are still people, and that they deserve an opportunity to be rehabilitated if possible. But even if they deserve to be warehoused in a prison for the rest of their lives, it does us no purpose other than to brutalize the rest of us to kill those people, because killing people just is not a way that I want my children to believe is a way to solve a problem, by killing someone.
As quoted by Coretta Scott King, an evil deed is not redeemed by an evil deed of retaliation. Justice is never advanced in the taking of human life. Morality is never upheld by legalized murder.
The proponents don't rely on the deterrence argument anymore. Study after study after study has shown either no difference in murder rates between states that have the death penalty and those that don't, or that, as you say, murder rates go down. So they don't argue deterrence anymore. The main argument given by proponents of capital punishment is the vengeance argument, that society has the right to exact its pound of flesh. It has the right to exact vengeance upon the murderer. It's the eye for an eye. If you kill, you forfeited your life. I can't deny that at a very instinctual gut level, that's part of human nature. The feeling that you want revenge or vengeance is a part of human nature, but it seems to me to be one of the baser parts of human nature, something that a civilized society needs to struggle against. And it's a shame when a society bases its system of justice on the concept of vengeance. It just is it's a waste of time. It's an appeal to our baser instincts rather than our higher instincts. I think what Americans aren't aware of is the outrage in the international community at the idea of executing juveniles. International law forbids the execution of juveniles, but the United States, because we're individual states that have the death penalty, just doesn't abide by that. I think it's just another example of how the United States, on the issue of capital punishment, is really out of touch with the rest of the world. Most of the rest of the Western industrial world has recognized that the death penalty is an anachronism, it's a barbarism. There is no death penalty, no capital punishment anymore in all of Western Europe, Canada, Mexico, the list goes on and on, Scandinavia. The countries that do use capital punishment the most in the world, and if you can tell something about a country by the company it keeps, the countries that use the death penalty most are China, Iraq, Iran, the Soviet Union, and the United States, and South Africa. Even South Africa has a moratorium on capital punishment right now. So the company that the United States is in terms of those countries that use capital punishment the most, I think really shows, it's a reflection of the type of societies that they are. Backward, repressive societies feel the need to execute their own citizens. Progressive, industrial, enlightened societies recognize that this is just a throwback to witch burning and sacrificing virgins to the gods. It's just a waste of time. It doesn't do what its proponents says it does, and as a matter of fact, it probably has the opposite effect because it just increases the amount of violence in the society. It teaches that a solution to a problem is to kill somebody.
No man had a right to rob me of 9 years of my freedom. But spiritually, I look at it as a spiritual chastisement. Being on death row, I'm able to love. I'm able to love people regardless. Unperverted, unconditional love. To have that kind of love. Because I was on death row. Because when you're there, you learn to love men despite what their circumstances.
The following disturbing scenes were filmed illegally in the death row of a United States prison after the reintroduction of the death penalty in 1976. The film, which shows the final hours of a prisoner who is about to be electrocuted, was made at the request of the prison governor.
When you get out of the elevator, come in here.
There's no way that they can give me back my son by executing someone else.
For those of you that have made it to the end, I invite you to blast us with your comments. Let's have a lively discussion about this. We've had enough death.